Hey, welcome back. You've been waiting patiently for me to do a video comparing the RCBS 505 balance beam scale to the FX120i scale. Well, I'm going to disappoint you today. This video is even going to disappoint my mom. I did test, but the outcome is not what you're expecting. And that doesn't matter which of the two outcomes you're expecting. So for today's video, let's have an open mind and think about this scientifically, because I do science, not sales pitch and not circus. So I want to give you good information that's going to work in your context, whether your context is a 284 Winchester, a 223 Remington, or anything in between. Variations in powder charge are going to have some effect somewhere. That's pretty obvious. I mean, it's intuitive that if we have variations in the amount of energy in the exchange, we're going to have variations in the outcome. But it's not as simple to detect as you might expect. Before we start, let's talk about the scientific method and the first step that I took in order to plan my testing. And that first step was to see what the difference in charge weight was between the two scales, a simple charge-to-charge comparison. Well, with the FX120i, I can get plus or minus 0.02 grains using the dispenser unit on top. On the other hand, if I do it by hand myself, I can get it to 0 minus 0.02 grains. Well, that's closer, but in reality, that's resolution of the scale. So it's probably closer to 0.03 grains in reality, or even 0.04. Now, when I do a comparison between that and the 505 scale, simply making charges with a 505 scale using this brand new RCBS trickler, which I do not recommend buying because I did not like using it. Using my iPad to make sure I had a parallax-free, enlarged, magnified view of the pointer, I got variations that were plus or minus 0.06 grains. In other words, the total range was 0.12 grains for the 25 charges that I threw. Remember that FX120i is plus or minus 0.02. The balance beam scale gives us a variation total of 1/10 of a grain more than the FX120i does. This is where we start. We start with our known factor, and that is a variation in powder charge. Now, if I was an unethical YouTuber, I would simply pick the cartridge that gave me the outcome that I wanted. If I wanted them to both be the same and there'd be no difference, I'd use a 284 Winchester, because when we look at the trend line for our velocity versus powder charge, we find that 1/10 of a grain is only worth 4 feet per second. On the other hand, if I wanted to be completely unethical, the opposite direction, say you absolutely must have a milligram scale, I would use a 223 Remington, which is 11 feet per second per 1/10 of a grain of powder charge. Minimum might be 12. It just depends on what part of the charge range you're in. So we have to be very careful about what we use to assess the quality of the information. That's not the only thing that we have to worry about when we start looking at this. I'm going to give you a quick lesson in the statistical underpinnings real quick. I'm not going to do a bunch of math here, because if you wanted to do math, I would suggest several other channels on YouTube. Instead, I want to show you a basic understanding of stacking tolerances. Let's take, for example, a situation where we're going to evaluate velocity. Now, I have picked 5 out of many random independent variables, as we call them, that affect the outcome of any given shot. The primer, for instance, has a fixed amount of brisance, or energy, that it's going to put into the equation how it's going to ignite the powder. Then we have the case itself, because the case has an internal capacity limit. The changes in internal capacity from piece of brass to piece of brass is an independent variable. Next is the powder charge itself. How much does it weigh? And better yet, how much energy is in each granule of powder? We don't have any idea. We assume it's all the same. But is it? Next is the bullet, the outer dimensions of it, the bearing surface length, the bearing surface diameter. Those can also affect your velocity. And last but not least, let's just take this case over here and assess the neck tension. I now have 5 independent variables that all have an input to the outcome of any given shot. Now, if I assign all these variables to a normal distribution and give them a standard deviation of 2 feet a second, just for the sake of demonstration, we come up with something that looks like this. We have 5 variables that, when their outcomes are assessed together, give us a final outcome, a delta velocity from the average. And if we run this time and time again, we start to see a pattern. One will go positive when the other goes negative, and they cancel each other out partially or completely. Sometimes we see them all go one direction. They stack up and those velocity numbers change. This is why we have so much variation in our extreme spreads. And that's why it is so difficult to get any real numbers out of any kind of testing on small samples. As a matter of fact, while I was doing this evaluation, I created a spreadsheet that simulates normal distribution with a 2 foot per second standard deviation for 5 independent variables and took it in 10-shot samples for 2,000 shots. And what I found is the ES was all over the place, as was the SD, to the point where from sample to sample, you might think you had a really good load or a really bad load. I've told you this before in this video, but sometimes we miss these things and we don't think about how they impact the way that we are trying to assess the outcomes of a change. Now that we have an underlying understanding that variables cancel each other out, we have to come up with a way of modeling that. And that's called the root sum square method. In other words, we sum the squares of all of our variables. And then we take the square root of that. So if we take the square root of 2 squared times 5, we end up with 4.65. Now, this tells us that our standard deviation, even though we've added 5 different 2SD items, is likely on a small sample size again to be about 4.65. And that's going to give us an underpinning for evaluating a change in variation. If we go into this calculation, we then can take out one of the 2's and replace it with a 3, which is going to increase the standard deviation of that one thing for the powder charge. And we rerun the calculation and we get a standard deviation of 5. Even though we increased that standard deviation from 2 to 3, which it increases the ES for that particular factor from about 14 to about 19, we have a very small change in our standard deviation, which means that when we're sampling, we're going to have an extremely hard time detecting this difference with any reliability and any confidence level. I've talked about confidence levels before in previous videos like this one about primer seeding. The key here is to make sure that we have an adequate signal to noise ratio in order to adequately understand what we're seeing in our data. Because data doesn't do us any good. Only information does. Most statistics is bothered with the concept of mean or average. We don't care what the average velocity is between the two because we can adjust a little bit on what we put into the scale. Instead, we're worried about the variation from them. So that variation is the key here. Well, when I start looking at the various cartridges I have available, my best case scenario is the 223 Remington, which is going to take approximately 1,300 rounds from each scale in order to get to the 95% confidence level. In other words, we're going to burn out an entire barrel to figure out if there's a difference in the variation of the velocity. Well, that's a little beyond my means. I don't know about you, but I can't afford to throw away an entire barrel's worth of components for it just to figure out if there's a difference in velocity. If we go to a 284, the sample size, because my standard deviation is lower than it is with a 223 Remington, the sample size gets bigger because the difference gets smaller. As we start to see smaller and smaller differences in variation, the sample sizes get exponentially larger. As a matter of fact, we got to the point where I wasn't doing it in rounds, I was doing it in barrels. And at that point, it's not worth doing that test. I'm not saying that there is no difference. I'm saying that detecting the difference is the challenge and is a little too big of a challenge for a small YouTuber like me. Maybe one of the big ammunition manufacturers could manage it, but I can't. Now let's get into the part that you really are worried about, and that's precision. Take this, for example. This is a ladder test. When I do a ladder test, I'm looking for an area where differences in charge don't change the vertical point of impact as much. In other words, having variations in the charge are going to have less effect on the point of impact at 600 yards. So if we're doing a test for group size, for instance, at 600 yards with the variations between the two scales, we have a couple of different situations. We could be completely out of the node where we have no idea if we're going to have anything or not that's readable. We could be perfectly in the center of the node where we're likely to have very, very, very small differences, which means that the signal to noise ratio is very low. Or we could be teetering right on the edge of a node to where the ones that are in the node are going to group pretty well, and the ones that are out in the node are going to group very high and off to one side. And that's going to make for a very large difference in the group size. None of which serves you as the person that's trying to use that information to, well, to make a decision. If you reduce the variation from any particular variable in your equation, your overall distribution of your result is going to be reduced. In other words, a milligram scale that is repeatable and reliable is going to give you a better result than a balance beam scale that is not. Now, I'm not saying all balance beam scales are not. What I'm saying is this balance beam scale is not. It's been sitting on my bench for 20 years. I cleaned it, but it's still, well, aged. And it has never been tuned by anybody that knows how to tune a scale, or anybody else for that matter. So in essence, an out-of-the-box 505 RCBS scale is going to give you more variation in your powder charge than what your FX120i does. Whether that makes a difference to you or not is a completely different conversation. And whether that difference is even detectable over time is going to be an even longer conversation. So let's just cancel the testing here because we can't really tell anything from the testing that's going to serve you well. Instead, I want to give you some basic understanding and underpinning to how to make this decision so that you can make a good decision for you and maybe save some money if you don't need to spend it. The first thing to consider is your context. What are you attempting to do with the rifle? Because that is critical to making a decision. In this case, if you're out hunting deer or elk at moderate ranges, up to 600 yards, even 800 yards, that balance beam scale is probably going to be just fine for you. Good load development is going to make up for any deficiency in the scale, and you will be just fine. Now, if we take hunting and we say we're going to hunt varmints instead, the ranges tend to get shorter. The animals get smaller, so precision is more necessary. But at the same time, once again, we're taking very few shots at a time. It doesn't matter if you can put 20 consecutive shots into a 1-inch group at 600 yards because you're only going to shoot that coyote one time. So realistically, for hunting, I would say that either one is acceptable. You don't have to step up to the milligram scale if you don't want to. Moving from hunting into plinking, you're going to shoot a lot more rounds plinking than you do hunting, which means you're going to spend more time reloading. The FX120i, especially with a dispenser on top of it, is much faster than what the balance beam scale is, which means that you're going to get more ammunition loaded more quickly so you can go out and do that fun stuff of shooting more. And this applies to plinking and all competition shooting sports alike. So saving time at the reloading bench in order to shoot more is an advantage of having a milligram scale with a dispenser on top of it. A very expensive proposition, but I like to think of it as my time has value, and I don't want to spend it unnecessarily. Now, if you're doing something that is very precision-oriented, something like PRS shooting, well, guess what? The FX120i isn't necessary. As a matter of fact, a milligram scale is not necessary at all. You can use one if you so desire, but the likelihood is the precision provided by a balance beam scale would be perfectly adequate. It's just slower again. Moving into some of the more precision-oriented sports like F-class and bench rest. This is a completely different equation at this point. Now we're talking about risk mitigation. In F-class, yes, it is possible to shoot incredible scores with this balance beam scale. You have to do better load development. You have to understand what you're up against and pay attention when you're loading. It's a very slow process. It takes a lot of time. But it is absolutely possible to shoot excellent scores at 600 and 1,000 yards with this very 505 scale. On the other hand, reducing the variables to reduce the risks is something of value in both of those disciplines. So for me, a milligram scale does have an advantage for long-range precision shooting. It's very slight, to the point of being almost undetectable, even for an F-class or long-range bench rest shooter. But it is there. You just have to have a little faith. So in the end, you're going to have to choose a scale that suits your needs and your usage and your desire to spend more or spend less time at the bench. All right, guys, that's all I have for this one. The 505 scale is perfectly capable of absolutely incredible accuracy. Even this one, that's a little bit variable in its outcomes, but the milligram scale is going to give you more certainty deep down in the back of your mind where you believe your rifle shoots well, and that makes you shoot better. So always be aware that you might get something psychologically out of using a more precise piece of equipment. Until next time, shoot straight, think about your expenditures on reloading equipment because they aren't all necessary. I'll see you in the next video.